Thanks very much. Is this on and working now, this microphone? Okay. Okay, fine. All right, before I say anything about Brownlow, I want to clear the air. I'm going to start by polling the audience here. I want everybody who's at this point got a favorable impression of Brownlow, that is, who thinks he's more a saint than a sinner. I want you, please, on the count of 3, to yell hurrah for Brownlow. On the count of 3, okay? And I mean, don't just say it. I want you to shout it, okay? So those of you who like Brownlow, on the count of 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, now, everybody who's got an unfavorable opinion of Brownlow at this point, who thinks he's more sinner than saint, on the count of 3, you will yell, down with Brownlow, okay? And really yell it. 1, 2, 3. Okay, okay, I can see where we're tending this. Okay, that's about what I expected, including the mostly neutral reaction here in Middle Tennessee. Now, when I talk about Brownlow in East Tennessee, the reaction is not so neutral overall. But anyway, it's about what I expected. But whatever side you're on, don't worry, because I'm not here today to try to change your minds about Brownlow. I'm really not. To bury him rather than praise him, I don't know if I'd say that. But what I'm here to do today is to offer you, as historians are supposed to do, some historical context, some understanding of past people and events, and not to judge Brownlow. Brownlow is one of those historical figures badly in need of some historical context and some historical understanding. And in the end, you might not change your mind about Brownlow, but I think hopefully you'll come out of this with a better understanding of the context in which he lived and worked. So let's start with his background, his early life. And he has been compared with Abraham Lincoln in this respect. And kind of looks like him in that picture a little bit. He was, in fact, like Lincoln, born into dire poverty on the frontier. In 1805 in southwestern Virginia, he was born, and that was still a semi-frontier area at that time. Both of his parents died when he was young. He and his siblings were parceled out to other relatives. Brownlow was apprenticed, which was a very common experience for young poor boys in that period. He was apprenticed as a carpenter and learned that trade as he grew up. At a revival meeting in 1825, he was converted, became a Christian, and thereafter eventually became a circuit-riding Methodist minister. Traveled all over southern Appalachia for years and years, and I mean all over southern Appalachia, not just East Tennessee, but southwestern Virginia, western North Carolina. Eventually, he settled in East Tennessee, and throughout his life, he was known as Parson Brownlow. By 1839, he decided that journalism was his calling. He established a newspaper in Elizabethton in East Tennessee, and then moved it to Jonesboro, and then finally in 1849, he moved it to Knoxville, where he remained the rest of his life. He used this newspaper of his to promote all of his pet causes, especially the Whig Party, of which he was a fervent partisan. One interesting thing about Brownlow is that while we know a lot about his public life, we know almost nothing about his personal life. With all the writing and speaking he did over his long career, he said very little about his private affairs. He did not leave a big batch of personal papers for historians, to rummage through after he died. So we don't really know much about his personal life at all. We do know that he married at age 21 to a woman named Eliza. In his telling of the tale, it was the only woman he ever courted. They remained married until his death. They had 7 children. About his physical appearance and his demeanor, we know quite a bit more thanks to photographs and descriptions by others. He was a tall man for that time. He was full 6 feet tall, weighed 175 pounds, and even into his old age, he remained trim and physically strong, which was a good thing for him, considering how often he was forced to defend himself physically over the years. He was, as you see here, clean-shaven all his life, even in the 1850s and 1860s when beards became all the rage for men. And, you know, of course, that's when Abraham Lincoln grew a beard in 1860, 61. Brownlow did not. He never grew a beard. As for his looks, the most charitable thing you can say is that he was not a handsome man. He admitted this frankly, by the way. This is one of the few ways that Brownlow ever poked fun at himself. In a lot of ways, he hadn't developed the art of laughing at himself much. When his enemies couldn't get at him in any other way, they made fun of his looks. And on one occasion, one of his enemies offered him an honorary membership in something called the Ugly Club. Brownlow was pleased to accept that, in fact. He thought that was funny. He thought that was hilarious. One neutral observer who got a good look at Brownlow in 1869, so he would have been in his mid-60s by then, said, but this of course would pertain to any stage of Brownlow's life, this observer said he looked like, quote, a damned old turkey buzzard. Brownlow had hardly any formal education. He was basically a self-taught man. And all through his life, he retained the sort of coarse demeanor of a frontiersman. You wouldn't call him, you wouldn't say exactly crude. He was not a crude man, but rather unpolished in his speech, in his dress, in his manners. His rustic origins, and this doesn't come across in pictures of him because he would dress up for formal portraits like this. But if you met him, you would have been impressed, as many people were by Lincoln, by his rustic origins. They were apparent no matter how long he lived and no matter how he brought himself up in the world. And he did. He did work up the ladder of success quite a ways. But he never made any attempt to hide these rustic origins. He never made any attempt to really refine himself so that you would think he was, you know, a man of some social stature. He was always just a very plain, unpolished man in his speech, in his manners, in his dress. And while he did work his way up the ladder of success, as I said, he was never what you would call a social climber. He was not someone who was anxious to ingratiate himself with the elite. He was a plain-spoken man. He was a plain-spoken man, but he was also, in the pulpit and on the stump, he was a forceful and engaging speaker. He was the kind of speaker who could captivate an audience and really, really hold them, sometimes for hours. He would not do this, however, like the great orators of that age. He wouldn't do it by giving these speeches that were full of, you know, elegant phrasing and classical allusions and intricate arguments that the great statesmen and the theologians of that era would use. Brownlow was very plain-spoken. You know. One person who saw him speak left this description. I think this is a good description of how Brownlow sounded when you heard him talking in the pulpit or in the, you know, on the stump. His talk is all random shots, no argument at all. Adjectives he uses in abundance, and the whole vocabulary of harsh words at his command. He tells many anecdotes, but never smiles. His nostrils are like a racehorse. His face is iron, and you can see by his eye that he does not fear the face of man. This observer's last remark captures very well another of Brownlow's prominent characteristics. He was absolutely fearless. He always said exactly what he thought. He said it in the most vehement way possible, whatever the consequences. The motto he placed on the masthead of his newspaper captures this well, I think expresses this attitude succinctly. Cry aloud and spare not. To which he later added another motto, independent in all things, neutral in nothing. Brownlow had a lot of enemies, at least as he saw it, and he spent the better part of his time denouncing. Among those who were on the receiving end of his rhetorical wrath over the years, and I'm going to give you a list of all of these he perceived as enemies, people he thought worth denouncing, which he did over and over. And this list is not exhaustive, but over the years, at one time or another, either on the pulpit, in the pulpit, on the press, in the press, or on the stump, he denounced Baptists, Presbyterians, Catholics, Mormons, Democrats, Republicans, blacks, Irish immigrants, drinkers, Sabbath breakers, bad poets, philandering husbands, rival editors, abolitionists, and above all, secessionists, about which I will say more in a few minutes. Brownlow was a skilled debater. He was well informed on the issues of the day, and he was capable of arguing, the issues on their merits. But that was not his preferred style. What he preferred was the ad hominem attack. Brownlow's attitude was, why debate the issue when you can simply humiliate your opponent with a few well-chosen insults? So let me give you a sampling of some of Brownlow's published insults. Now, his insults tended to be mean, even cruel, often outrageously false, but they could also be wickedly funny. So let me share a few of these, give you a sense of what Brownlow's rhetoric was like, especially in his published writing. Here's his description of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the famous abolitionist author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, who, by the way, he had never met and probably never even seen a picture of. Here's what he said about her, because she was an abolitionist. She is as ugly as original sin, an abomination in the eyes of civilized people, a tall, coarse, vulgar-looking woman, stoop-shouldered, with a long yellow neck and a long peaked nose through which she speaks. That part about the yellow neck, I think, is just brilliant, just absolute genius. Here's his description of a foot-washing ritual he claimed to have witnessed at a Baptist church. Never did I, before or since, see as many big, dirty feet washed in one pewter basin full of water. Baptist preachers he characterized as, quote, sectarian bigots, pigpen orators, and whiskey shop saints. At one point in his lifelong battle against the Presbyterians, Brownlow was delighted to learn that the Presbyterian Church had formed a national association, a national organization called the American Sunday School Union. He was delighted because he made a point of mentioning this thereafter very often, always abbreviating it the ASS Union. Brownlow, there was a distinguished Presbyterian minister that Brownlow fought a running battle with for years. Here's how Brownlow characterized this, a man of great distinction in theological circles. Brownlow dismissed him as, quote, a ruffian by birth and instinct, low-bred, false-hearted, a habitual adulterer, a loathsome blackguard, a notorious libeler, a common liar, and, for good measure, the son of an old revolutionary Tory. There are better men in hell than he is how Brownlow ended that diatribe. Here's his depiction of a rival newspaper. It has, from first to last, been edited by more broken-down preachers and lewd, lying, irresponsible men than any other single paper in existence. And yet, as far as depravity, lack of honor, and total disregard for truth, its present editor is head and shoulders above any other ruffian who has yet controlled its filthy columns. Here is his reply on being asked if he would consider serving as a chaplain in the Confederate Army in 1861. His reply, when I have made up my mind to go to hell, I will cut my throat and go direct and not travel there by way of the Southern Confederacy. Yeah, I particularly like that one too. Now, many of Brownlow's prejudices were quite distasteful for us today. He was thoroughly racist, like almost all white Americans back in that day. He was a confirmed racist. He delighted in portraying blacks in the usual stereotyped manner as mentally and morally inferior. Furthermore, his sentiments, even about some of those people who shared his skin color, could be quite appalling. During his run-in with Confederate authorities in 1861, he had this to say about the distinguished Confederate Secretary of War, Judah P. Benjamin. "He is nothing but a little Jew, and I expect no more mercy from him than was shown by his illustrious predecessors towards Jesus Christ." In the 1850s, when the federal government under Democratic President James Buchanan clashed with the Mormons, Brownlow said this in an editorial: "If Buchanan will send an army to Utah and exterminate the entire Mormon race, I will declare in favor of his administration." Brownlow's insults did not always go unanswered. Some of his enemies, in fact many of his enemies, responded in kind. One of them made a point of publicly announcing that he had named his dog after Brownlow, which today I suppose might be considered a compliment, but back in those days it was not so regarded. Here's what another one of his enemies fired back with after Brownlow had attacked him. And this response suggests that some of Brownlow's enemies lifted a leaf from his book in the matter of vilification. Anyway, here's what somebody fired back at Brownlow. "He lies with his pen, he lies with his tongue, he lies with his gestures, he lies through every pore of his shriveled hide. He is a monstrosity, as unnatural as P.T. Barnum's calf with 2 heads and 8 legs. His blood is hell broth, which Satan will one day sip with a long spoon. From his youth up to now, he has had no personal controversy without attacking the wives, fathers, mothers, grandfathers, grandmothers, brothers, sisters, children, uncles, aunts, and nephews of his opponents. He has never had an hour's happiness except in the unhappiness of others." Some of those that Brownlow denounced decided that verbal dueling was not sufficient to redeem their honor. In the course of his long career, Brownlow was, and this is all a matter of historical record, Brownlow was many times threatened, several times sued, several times beaten up, on at least 2 occasions shot at, and 1 time hit, hanged in effigy, indicted, imprisoned, exiled by his opponents. But these reprisals did not silence him. They merely gave him more ammunition to fire off in his devastating broadsides. Let me put it this way, if you haven't already gotten the point. Compromise, moderation, and fence mending were simply not part of Brownlow's public character. They were totally foreign to him in his public persona. His response to opposition, instead of reaching out to his opponent, tried to mend fences or compromise, his response to opposition was invariably to renew his attacks with even more fury, more vituperation. And he was totally unapologetic about it. Looking back on his 40-year career in the year 1869, he said this, his 40-year career as a political and religious partisan, he said, "If I had my life to live over, I would pursue exactly the same course I have pursued, only more so." Brownlow took up a lot of different causes in his life, as I suggested. But mainly he is remembered today for 2 things. His stand in favor of the Union during the Civil War and his 4-year tenure as radical governor of Tennessee during Reconstruction. In both of those roles, for which he is primarily remembered, both of those roles, he brought into play all these characteristics that I've been talking about that marked his pre-war career. Between 1861 and 1869, you see over and over again this defiant and uncompromising attitude. You see the vitriolic, rhetorical thrashing of his opponents. You see the bold, some would say rash, disregard for the personal consequences of his words and his actions. So, let's look now at the issue of his wartime unionism. We'll look at that first, and then we'll move on to Reconstruction. But first, a little historical context for those who are not familiar with the context of Civil War Tennessee. First of all, it's important to remember that until the Civil War actually broke out, Brownlow was very much in the mainstream of public opinion in Tennessee. He was very much in the mainstream of Tennessee public opinion on this issue of secession versus unionism. He wasn't just in the mainstream of East Tennessee, he was in the mainstream of Tennessee as a whole until the war broke out. Tennessee was not in the forefront of the secession movement. Okay? When the Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November of 1860, and the 7 states of the Deep South immediately, very soon thereafter, seceded as a result, Tennessee pursued a moderate course. Okay? Tennessee refused to jump on the secessionist bandwagon. In a statewide referendum that was held in February of 1861, Tennessee voters, and I mean the majority of Tennessee voters in all 3 sections of the state, rejected secession, as did the other states of the Upper South in that period known to historians as the Secession Winter. Brownlow's view during that secession winter, up until the time the war broke out in the spring, Brownlow's view was, like that of most Tennesseans, that secession was a gross overreaction to Lincoln's election. Okay? The Lower South's position, that is the position of the secessionists who took the Lower South out of the Union immediately after Lincoln's election, their position was, their argument was, Lincoln is not just anti-slavery, he's a closet abolitionist. Okay? And his election is a dire threat to slavery. That was their first argument. It is a grave insult to Southern honor, the secessionists claim, and it is a serious threat to the South's power in the national government. And for all those reasons, the secessionists of the Lower South justified seceding from the Union. Brownlow's response to this was, that's nonsense. Brownlow and those who thought like him. Nonsense, he said. First of all, and he said this over and over and over during that critical period of the secession winter, Brownlow said it over and over again on the stump and in the columns of his newspaper. First of all, he said, he pointed out, Lincoln has guaranteed the preservation of slavery. He has assured the South he is not going to interfere with slavery where it exists. Now, Lincoln was opposed to the further spread of slavery into the territories, but Brownlow wanted everybody to remember that Lincoln was not an abolitionist. Furthermore, he said, he reminded the secessionists over and over again, while the Republicans have now captured the White House, he said, that's it. That's as far as Lincoln's power goes, because the Democrats still will control Congress. The Supreme Court is still predominantly Democratic, he said. So his argument, Brownlow's argument was, Lincoln can do no real harm at this point, okay? So according to Brownlow, secession at that point was a wild, irrational, reckless reaction to a non-existent threat. Okay? But Brownlow went further than that. Brownlow also proposed a theory about how the secession of the Lower South had come about. What was really behind this secession movement in the Lower South? And it might not surprise you to know that his interpretation was a conspiracy theory. According to Brownlow, secession was a plot that had been hatched by a small cabal of Southern politicians and planters and other prominent leaders in their own selfish interest. Okay? These power-hungry Southern oligarchs, is how he referred to them often, according to Brownlow's theory here, had been trying for years to take total control of the U.S. government. But they had now been foiled by Lincoln's election. And as a result, what did they do? Because they had been foiled in their plot to take control of the U.S. government, what they did was take the South out of the Union so they could create their own nation that they could then rule without interference. That's Brownlow's theory. Now, how had, Brownlow asked rhetorically, how had these secessionist oligarchs in the Lower South, how had they managed to get the common people of the South. Because remember, Brownlow is saying this is an elite conspiracy. But how had they gotten the, from all the evidence, the common people, the white people of the South, were going along with this too, in the Deep South, the Lower South. How had they gotten how had the oligarchs gotten the common people in the Lower South to go along with this nefarious plot? Brownlow's answer to that was they had used lies and propaganda and demagoguery to whip up hysteria among the common people, the common white people, and about Lincoln's intentions, see. And those they couldn't, deceive or frighten into following them into secession, Brownlow says they silenced by force. So as far as Brownlow is concerned, the common people had either been panicked, misled by demagoguery, or were actually under threat of force by these secessionist oligarchs in the Deep South. Now, the North was not blameless in all of this, Brownlow said. There was blame to go around here, he said. There was a small clique, said Brownlow, of radical abolitionists in the North, extremists, who had agitated the slavery issue and succeeded in turning a lot of Northerners against the South, and also succeeded in making Southerners fearful about the future of slavery, okay? And this contributed to the tensions in the Lower South that those Southern oligarchs had manipulated, had taken advantage of to carry out their evil plan, okay? Brownlow especially blamed the ministers on both sides. Being a minister himself, he was especially unhappy about the role of the ministers. Among the radical abolitionists of the North, he said, and the radical secessionists of the South, there were many ministers, and he had especially harsh words for them. Here's what he said in a speech in 1862 about the ministers. A more unmitigated, God-forsaken set of scoundrels do not live than the preachers of the gospel who have stirred up the passions of the people, North and South. Now, this is something a lot of you are aware of, but I want to stress it here again. It's important to understand that Brownlow did not take this anti-secession stand because he was anti-slavery. Brownlow was by no means anti-slavery. In fact, just the opposite. Brownlow was deeply committed to the institution of slavery, and an outspoken, in the years before the Civil War, he was an outspoken defender of it. In 1858, in fact, he traveled all the way to Philadelphia to debate a Northern abolitionist minister on the subject of slavery. And in this speech, and in many other of his speeches and writings, he portrayed slavery as a benevolent institution. This was Brownlow's argument, and the argument of many other Southerners too. But Brownlow especially articulated this. Brownlow said that slavery is a benevolent institution, not just good for white people, he said, but good for black people. He really believed this. It's good for black people, he said. Why? Well, it took these black people, these supposedly, as he called them, heathen, savage Africans. It took them out of the jungles of Africa and brought them to this country, introduced them to Christianity and civilization, of course. And furthermore, he said, slavery is sanctioned by God, sanctioned by the Bible. And he could quote chapter and verse on that. Brownlow even went so far in that debate as to urge that the United States conquer Africa as a territory and enslave all its people for the good of those people. Here's what he said about that. If the U.S. should conquer Africa as a territory, it would, quote, force the millions of indolent, degraded, and starving natives there to labor and thereby elevate them to the dignity of men made in the image of God. God looks to the people of the United States to raise up the savages of Africa, and I honestly believe He requires us to do that work. When secession came, Brownlow warned that what the secessionists were doing would not make slavery more secure, but just the opposite. He said, less secure. Because, he said, and Brownlow said this over and over and over again during the secession winter. He spoke directly to He's aimed his words directly at the secessionists, the lower South. And he said, listen, you people, you are so misguided. What you are doing with secession is very likely to provoke a war with the Union states. Okay? And if there's a war, it could very well end with the destruction of slavery. And he said it flat out. Secession is the shortcut to abolition. Now, Brownlow was wrong about a lot of things in his life, but on this, he was absolutely right. He was right. When the war began in April of 1861, it changed everything in Tennessee. I'd said Tennessee as a whole was moderate up to that point, but with the outbreak of the war, things were very different. They were transformed, in fact, overnight. Now there's a war on. Now there's a war on, and Tennesseans are going to have to choose sides. Okay? And for most Tennesseans, there was no choice at all. I mean, most white Tennesseans, whatever they might have thought about the wisdom of secession, once Abraham Lincoln announces that he is marshaling an army to invade the South and put down the secessionists, most whites in Tennessee had no other choice but to join with their Southern brothers to defend the South against Northern invaders. However, the great majority of East Tennesseans felt differently. The great majority of East Tennesseans, including Brownlow, remained loyal to the Union. And the question of why this is true is a difficult one, and I can't go into it deeply. But basically, and to put it very simply, East Tennessee was a region apart. Its people had always perceived themselves as a region apart. They were isolated geographically. It was a land, compared to the Deep South and compared to Middle and West Tennessee, it was a land with few slaves, few big plantations, few planters, few economic connections to the Deep South. And East Tennesseans had throughout their history always felt a sense of apartness from the rest of the South, a sense of differentness, even a sense of antagonism towards Middle and West Tennessee. And in 1861, this sense of apartness, the sense of differentness, the sense of antagonism translated into continuing support for the Union when the rest of the South went with the Confederacy, or most of the rest of the South. Brownlow, along with other prominent East Tennessee Unionists, including Andrew Johnson, who was a U.S. Senator at the time from East Tennessee, now came together. With the outbreak of war, these East Tennessee leaders came together to lead East Tennessee in a stand against the Confederacy. This alliance between Brownlow and Andrew Johnson is worthy of a few words here. This was a remarkable instance of politics creating strange bedfellows, because these were two long-time bitter enemies. Johnson was a Democrat. Brownlow had, who was a committed Whig, had battled Johnson for decades. Brownlow had once publicly denounced Johnson as, quote, a contemptible political prostitute, an unprincipled knave, an unmitigated liar and calumniator, and a villainous coward. Now, if you know anything about Andrew Johnson, you know that he could reply in kind. He called Brownlow, among many other things, a vile miscreant. Now, though, these two longtime enemies come together in 1861 in the cause of the Union in East Tennessee. Brownlow did his part by helping to organize two big Unionist conventions in East Tennessee held in May and June of 1861. He helped also by continuing to crank out his anti-secessionist editorials in his newspaper, the Knoxville Whig. He even kept, until Tennessee actually technically, legally went out of the Union in June of 1861, Brownlow kept a U.S. flag flying from his office window in Knoxville. Brownlow's paper was the only paper in all of the Confederate states that opposed secession, continued to oppose secession after the war began. And his rhetoric was as uncompromising as ever. In a typical column written during the summer of 1861, Brownlow said that the Confederacy was, quote, a bogus government that originated in fraud, falsehood, and perjury. Now, the Confederate authorities were at first inclined to be lenient towards these obnoxious East Tennessee Unionists. They were hoping, the Confederate authorities hoped that with the passage of time, these East Tennessee Unionists, who were in, as I said, a substantial majority in East Tennessee, would eventually, they'd calm down, they'd come around, they would accept, the secession of their state. However, as time went by and it became clear that the East Tennessee Unionist resistance was continuing, and especially after an incident which many of you are familiar with, I'm sure, in November of 1861, in which bands of Unionist saboteurs burned down some key railroad bridges in East Tennessee. Especially after that, the Confederate authorities finally cracked down on the East Tennessee Unionists. They rounded up several hundred people suspected of involvement in the bridge burning. They arrested them, threw them in jail, and wound up hanging several of them, 5 of them in fact. This only provoked retaliation from the Unionists. They fought back only that much harder against the Confederates, provoking even harsher Confederate retribution. And as many of you know, eventually the situation in East Tennessee evolved into what you might also even call a civil war within a civil war. The Unionists fighting the Confederate authorities within the heart of the Confederacy. Brownlow, during this period of the Confederate crackdown in late 1861, was arrested by the Confederate authorities. He was imprisoned in Knoxville, and he was told that he would be tried for treason against the Confederacy unless he took an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy. It was at this time that some people would say that Brownlow achieved his only moment of real greatness. Okay? He adamantly refused to sign that oath and thereby save his neck, and he calmly prepared for the hanging that he expected, even going so far as to write out a speech that he intended to give on the gallows in which he justified his stand for the Union and urged the East Tennessee Unionists to keep up the fight. When a Confederate general visited him in the prison to try to persuade him, to save his neck by taking this simple oath of allegiance, Brownlow told him to his face, "I will die before I take such an oath. I do not acknowledge that you have a real Confederate government. I regard it as nothing but a big Southern mob." To the regret of many people then and since, Brownlow did not hang. The Confederate authorities, acting with certain wisdom, decided that making a martyr out of him would have been counterproductive. So instead they exiled him to the north. He was escorted by Confederate troops from Knoxville through Chattanooga up to Nashville, which by that time was in the hands of the Union Army, and under a flag of truce he was turned over to the federal authorities. From there he went north and carried out a speaking tour of northern cities, a very successful speaking tour. He retired then to New Jersey and spent some weeks putting together a book about his experiences among the rebels, as he called it, which wound up selling 100,000 copies. And then he resumed his speaking tour, getting as much as $1,000 a speech. Now, in this book and in these speeches in the North, after his expulsion, Brownlow continued to insist that secession was nothing but a cabal, a plot carried out by this small group of demagogues, this clique of demagogues, and that the Southern masses has simply been panicked and deceived and browbeaten into supporting the Confederacy. This, of course, was dead wrong. This was just not true. Now, Brownlow really did believe it, but it wasn't true. The overwhelming, the very great majority of white people in the seceded states were committed secessionists. They had not been browbeaten, hoodwinked, or misled into supporting secession. When Union forces finally captured Knoxville in the fall of 1863, Brownlow returned there, reestablished his newspaper, renamed it the Knoxville Whig and Rebel Ventilator. I suppose that I've always been curious about why he called it the Rebel Ventilator, but I guess the only thing I can think of is that one way to ventilate something is to poke holes in it. Maybe that's the image he was trying to conjure up. I don't know, but anyway, it became the Knoxville Whig and Rebel Ventilator. And he resumed his editorial tirades against the Confederacy. By now, however, by middle of late 1863, Brownlow had actually come out in favor of emancipation. May surprise you, but be assured he did not do it out of any sympathy for the slave. He did it to help defeat the Confederacy and bring the Southern oligarchy to its knees. But by late 1863, he had come out for emancipation. As the war ended in the spring of 1865, a new state government was created in Tennessee. Brownlow was elected governor by a strictly Unionist electorate, and he thus entered on a new phase of his career, one that was, if possible, even more controversial than those preceding it. So, now, let me say a word or two about his career as a Reconstruction governor, which, as I say, many of you probably know something about already in all its notoriety. Brownlow's primary goal as Reconstruction Governor of Tennessee was to keep the rebels, as he always referred to them, meaning now, of course, the former Confederates, former supporters of the Confederacy, keep them from regaining political power. Now, had they gained political power in Tennessee, they would have dominated the state because they were in a large majority in the state as a whole. They were an overwhelming majority in Middle and West Tennessee. Okay? So, as far as Brownlow was concerned, if he's going to keep the rebels from regaining power, political power in Tennessee, they've got to be disfranchised. They cannot be allowed to vote. So one of the first things that the legislature did, as soon as the new government was formed in the spring of 1865, and the legislature was very compliant with Brownlow all through his tenure as governor, one of the first things the legislature did was pass a law disfranchising all the former rebels, anybody who had supported the Confederacy. And it also eventually set up a voter registration system controlled by the governor to make sure that only good Unionists were certified to vote. Brownlow went beyond that, though. He also publicly urged the Unionists in the state to seek revenge on the former Confederates, now that even with the war over and the former Confederates having surrendered. Brownlow urged vengeance against them. Through courts of law, he urged lawsuits, and he instituted a few himself, through social ostracism and even physical violence. His argument was the rebels put us, meaning us good Unionists, through hell during the war, and now it is payback time. Okay? And if the rebels didn't like it, he said, well, they can just pack up and leave the state. Ensuring that these former rebels were kept politically powerless and subjugated was not, however, enough for Brownlow. Among the Unionists in Tennessee, were a sizable number known as conservative Unionists, as opposed to Brownlow and his radical Unionists. Okay? During the war, these conservative Unionists had opposed emancipation when the radicals had come out for it, and the conservatives had advocated a lenient policy towards the Confederates. After the war, these conservative Unionists were ready to forgive the defeated Confederates and enfranchise them and welcome them back as fellow U.S. citizens. Right? To Brownlow, as you can imagine, these conservative Unionists, good Unionists though they had been during the war, to Brownlow these conservative Unionists were no better than the rebels, just as dangerous as the rebels. Okay? Now, he had no legal way to deprive them of the vote, but he managed to do it partially anyway through manipulation of the voter returns and manipulation of his power over voter registration. He managed to effectively disfranchise many of the conservative Unionists. But still, Brownlow worried about the security, about his administration's ability to stay in power. He was still not satisfied that he had done everything he could to keep himself in power, to keep the radicals in power and keep the rebels down. So in 1867, he took the most controversial step yet, again with a compliant legislature at his beckoning. That is enfranchising blacks. Now understand that at this point, early 1867, no other southern state had yet given black people the right to vote, and in fact most northern states did not allow blacks to vote at that time. Well, as you can imagine, a hue and cry went up throughout the state at this most ultra-radical measure. Brownlow's response was, quote, "A loyal Negro is worth far more than a disloyal white man." Again, though, his motive was hardly idealistic. Brownlow did not advocate the enfranchisement of blacks in Tennessee because he thought blacks deserved to vote and be equal citizens. He did it, for the political motives. If he had thought he could survive politically without enfranchising the blacks, he certainly would have been more than happy to do so. But anyway, with the help of the black voters and the disfranchisement of the rebels and the partial disfranchisement of the conservative Unionists, Brownlow in 1867 easily won re-election to his second two-year term as governor. From that time until the end of his term in 1869, the former Confederates increasingly responded to their powerlessness with organized violence, especially the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan, which they unleashed against any blacks active in politics and any whites who supported them. In response to this, in response to the organized violence of the Ku Klux Klan, and as a further measure to enforce the decrees of his administration, Brownlow had the legislature, and this is another one of his controversial measures, Brownlow had the legislature create what was called the State Guard. It was basically a militia, a radical militia, at the command of the governor, a radical army. And he used it against the Klan, and he occasionally used it to intimidate conservative Unionists too. Now, a lot of these things that Brownlow's administration did during these years were very expensive. Creating and mobilizing the State Guard, creating a new public school system. A whole new public school system was created. This was expensive, as was the Guard. Issuing state bonds in support of railroad construction also cost the state money. And there were some extraordinarily long legislative sessions too. Anyway, by the time, this is another charge leveled against Brownlow's administrations, by the time Brownlow left office, he had put the state millions of dollars in debt. Now in 1869, Brownlow left the governorship to take over a Senate seat, Tennessee Senate seat. He was elected by the legislature to the Senate. He resigned the governorship, went off to Washington. Not long after that, for complex reasons that I don't have time to discuss here, the former rebels took control in Tennessee. The radicals lost control, the former rebels were re-enfranchised, they took control of the state, and Tennessee's Reconstruction was quite abruptly over, just within months after Brownlow went off to Washington in 1869. He served in Washington until his Senate term expired in 1875. Then he returned home and died in Knoxville in 77. So that is a very brief survey of Brownlow's career. So let me now, in the time remaining, offer some thoughts, general thoughts about Brownlow's career and his place in history. Had the Civil War, this goes without saying, but had the Civil War never occurred, Brownlow would be a very minor, mostly forgettable historical character. He would certainly be interesting and amusing in some ways, but not terribly important historically. He was a polemicist for a lot of causes that most people, or many of which most people today don't think were worth arguing about. It is obviously his Civil War activities that brought him into the limelight. So what exactly did he do that made him important historically? Well, as I said, along with Andrew Johnson and the other Unionist leaders in East Tennessee, Brownlow played an instrumental role in organizing and solidifying and strengthening that movement of East Tennessee Unionists. Now, you got to understand that there were Unionists in many other parts of the Confederacy, but they didn't all have the leadership that brought them together and gave them the ability to present a united front against the Confederacy. With the exception of Western Virginia, there was no other really strong Unionist movement within the Confederacy. So Brownlow deserves a great deal of credit for this. If your sympathies are Unionist, you would give him credit for it, blame otherwise. This resistance within East Tennessee was historically significant. Brownlow helped launch it, and it continued after he was expelled from the state in early 1862. it certainly had an impact on the war by offering really organized resistance against the Confederate authorities in East Tennessee. The Unionists tied up thousands of Confederate troops. The Confederates had to post thousands of occupation troops in East Tennessee just to keep their own region under control once the Unionist movement had really been, really gotten underway. Okay? Now, this was obviously an important factor in the Civil War. These thousands of Confederate troops tied up just trying to keep East Tennessee under control were desperately needed at the front. So this weakened the Confederate armies. Okay? So Brownlow had an impact there. Brownlow also had an impact on the North in the war. That's in his speaking tours and in his book, he kept getting out that message that secession is not deeply rooted in the South. The common people have just been hornswoggled. This encouraged the North to believe that once they got their armies into the South, that all they had to do was show these people the light. Say, look, we've been misrepresented. We're really nice guys. The common people would come around and give up on this idea of secession. Okay? He really helped push that idea, and the North bought it. For a full year and a half after the war began, the Union armies pursued a conciliatory policy in all the parts of the South that they invaded, a policy of lenience, hoping that these Southern civilians would come around and renounce secession and re-embrace the Union. Well, of course, as I noted, this was an unrealistic assumption, but it prevailed for a year and a half until the North finally gave up on that idea. Now, about Brownlow's Reconstruction career. A lot of the charges leveled by his enemies are true. They can't be denied. But again, here's some context is helpful, I think. The state debt, he did run up the state debt by millions. But remember that part of the reason was that new education system, which gave an education for blacks. It was not only the best education system for whites they'd ever had in Tennessee, it was the first education system for blacks they ever had in the state. And it was expensive. Okay? So was rebuilding the railroad system. Now, a lot of the money that went into the railroad bonds was tainted by fraud and corruption, and a lot of it went to waste. But still, rebuilding the railroad system was absolutely critical for the economic welfare of the state. This was expensive. And keep in mind, too, that it was not just radical corruption going on in Brownlow's tenure as governor. Among the politicians and businessmen who profited from all the corruption going on with regard to the railroads were many conservative Unionists and former rebels, too. This was the Gilded Age. This was a period in American history, and not just in Tennessee history, but in American history, when corruption was everywhere in government and in business, okay? And I might note, the corruption in Tennessee did not disappear when Brownlow's radical administration was overthrown either. Corruption in Tennessee government continued under the former Confederates after they took over. By the way, Brownlow himself was never seriously implicated in any of this corruption. His enemies tried to find something to pin on him, but he was apparently, squeaky clean, or at least pretty clean. They never found anything to pin on him anyway. Now, about these controversial actions that Brownlow used to keep himself in power, manipulating the voting returns, manipulating the voter registration, using the state militia against legitimate political opponents like the conservative Unionists. Yes, in the strictest sense, all of these are indefensible. But what I want you to understand is that the political situation in Reconstruction Tennessee was unique and unprecedented. Unique and unprecedented. Okay? This was not politics as usual. What was happening in Tennessee in the post-Civil War period was not politics as usual. Brownlow's opponents, this was not like politics today, the normal give and take of politics. Brownlow's opponents, the former Confederates, absolutely rejected the legitimacy of his administration, of his regime, as they called it. And they did not hesitate to fight it with every means at their disposal, including violence, especially the bloody terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan. Both sides saw Reconstruction as a continuation of the Civil War. Okay? And the outcome, as they saw it, would necessarily be winner take all. So this was a fight to the death. As I say, this was not politics as usual. Okay? And what the rebels were going to do once they were in power was deprive blacks of all their rights as far as they could, okay? What I'm saying is that no political compromise was possible in Reconstruction Tennessee. It's not politics as usual, as I said, and we assume as Americans there's always some kind of a compromise that can be worked out, you know? People feel strongly on one side or the other, but that's okay, we can work something out. Impossible in Reconstruction Tennessee, absolutely impossible. So this question of whether a more skillful governor than Brownlow, a more conciliatory governor than Brownlow, a more ethical governor than Brownlow could have governed the state more successfully or more fairly is essentially irrelevant. It's irrelevant. Now, Brownlow was a poor politician. There's no doubt about it. Let me say a reason about this. A word about the reason Brownlow was such a poor politician. He was a terrible politician. The reason was the lessons, he came late to politics. I mean, he was not a real office holder until 1865. He'd been involved in politics, but not in office holding. But remember that the lessons he had learned all of his life as a minister and as a newspaper editor, the lessons he had learned were all the wrong lessons for a politician. What Brownlow had learned over the years was that the more strident you are, the more invective you unleash, the more spiteful you are, the more successful you are, His congregations kept getting larger. His newspaper, kept selling more newspapers. So Brownlow naturally concluded before 1865 that behaving like that was the key to success. But of course, it's not the key to success for a politician in a democracy. Okay? So that's why, Brownlow was a poor politician. But again, I say it didn't matter. If he had been the best politician in the world, there was no compromise. Nobody could have ruled Tennessee between 1865 and 1870 in a way that was acceptable to all concerned. The freed people, the Confederates, and everybody, impossible. So Brownlow's political ineptitude is basically irrelevant. Okay. Keep in mind too what happened, when the radical regime collapsed. Brownlow's regime, or the radical regime, was in power only 4 years, but during that period, blacks enjoyed full political and civil rights in Tennessee. As soon as the former Confederates took control in 1869, they undid all of that, or all of that they could. They dismantled the state school system and consigned blacks to a third-rate education. They repealed many of the bills protecting black civil rights. They systematically disfranchised the freed people through poll taxes and other means. These conditions endured for another century after that. One last point I want to make is about Brownlow's public versus private persona. And this is interesting because there's a lot of evidence to show that in his personal life, he was a very different person from the way he came across in his public life. Even if his enemies, some of his enemies noted that in private, he was always genial, even with people he was opposed to politically or religiously. He was genial, he was sympathetic, he was soft-spoken. He was always loaning people money, even his political enemies, and never asked for it back. He lost a lot of money co-signing notes. As far as his racism, this guy who was, preaching that slaves were barbarians and that slavery was good for them is the same person who, after the war, generously gave help to establish a church for freed blacks in Knoxville. He gave money and a letter of recommendation for its minister to aid in his fundraising. This Brownlow, who damned all the rebels to hell after the war, was at the same time privately advising Andrew Johnson to pardon them. Okay? And he personally reconciled with many of the former rebels too, including his archenemy Isham Harris, who was the secessionist governor of the state and who had been one of his main targets from 1861 to 65. So, Brownlow once wrote that no sermon should be longer than an hour. Here's what he said: "Of all the kinds of death that people ever died, there is none so distressing as that of being preached to death." Now, he violated that rule frequently, but I will not, because I think it's a good rule. But before I do, I want to take another poll. I want to do that same poll over again, just see how you feel. Okay, everybody who likes Brownlow now, say on the count of 3, hurrah for Brownlow. 1, 2, 3. Hurrah for Brownlow. How about that? I did change some minds. But I wasn't out to do that. I'm not preaching. Okay, now, those of you who have an unfavorable impression of Brownlow, on the count of 3, down with Brownlow. 1, 2, 3. Okay, well, at least more people have opinions, whether pro or con. By the way, it may interest you to know that in 1981, the Tennessee Historical Quarterly polled historians of the state, Tennessee historians across the state, asking them to rank all of Tennessee's governors from best to worst on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the worst and 10 being the best. Brownlow came in dead last, with an average score of, get this, 1.63 out of a possible 10, which was way below the next to last, who was Ray Blanton, which a lot of you may remember, wound up going to prison. Thank you.
I don't think you took it off, you know, look, it's still up there. Oh. We have time for questions. Anybody? I'm sure you would.
I'll be glad to answer questions if there are any questions. Yes, front row.
The remarks that you made today taken from a document you're working on or you published?
The question is, I'm glad you asked that so that I can say no. The question is, am I preparing a biography of Brownlow? And the answer is no. In some ways, I wish I was. He is badly in need of a new biography.
I'm looking for a source to read more about it.
Well, I have to tell you, the only full-scale biography of Brownlow available was written in the 1940s or 30s or 40s by E. Merton Coulter, and it's still the best thing with the details. It is very anti-Brownlow. You may find that congenial or you may not, but it's a very old work. But somebody needs to write a new biography of Brownlow. Yes, he was. Coulter was a prominent historian of the 30s and 40s at Georgia. Yes?
Is Brownlow the one that ran Harris off to Mexico?
Yes, yes, yes. Well, what happened was that at the end of the war, when the Confederate Army, Harris, the governor of Tennessee, when the state government collapsed after the Union invasion of the state, Harris joined the Confederate Army as a staff officer. And when the war was over, he was intending to come home like all former Confederate soldiers, but Brownlow put a price on his head. He issued a proclamation saying this man is a public enemy and put a price on his head. So Harris left for Mexico and I think later spent some time in Europe and finally, several years later, came back.
Now, did they become, or did they get together, did that allow Harris to come back?
Yes, ultimately Brownlow revoked that. After passions had cooled a little later in Reconstruction, Brownlow revoked that proclamation. Harris came back to the state and, as you noted, was eventually elected to the Senate. So they actually served in the Senate together. They were the two senators from Tennessee for a while, and that's when I said they kind of reconciled. Brownlow became friendly with him. Yeah?
When did he become governor? Did he become governor during the war?
Yeah, about the same month that the war ended, effectively, April of 1865, just as the war was ending. Harris was still in the Confederate Army at that point. Yeah, the state government had just dissolved with the Union invasion of the state. Other questions?
What role did he play then in bringing Tennessee back into the Union?
Oh, a very great role. Yeah, I wish I had more time to go into what he was doing. Tennessee became the first of the former Confederate states to be readmitted to the Union, and it was precisely because it was under the control of these radical Unionists led by Brownlow at the time, when none of the other 11 or other 10 Confederate states was in that position. So, as a reward for supporting, the radical cause as a reward for voting for the 14th Amendment in the summer of 1866. Congress readmitted Tennessee to the Union then, and it was a long time thereafter before the other former Confederate states were readmitted. Yeah. Yeah.
When you make your talk in Knoxville, are your poll results different?
There are fewer neutrals, but I'd say that overall the proportions are about the same when I talk in Knoxville. Yeah.
I was surprised that you said basically it was more or less irrelevant what, if he would have acted differently to the outcome. And obviously the situation in Reconstruction Tennessee was difficult, but I mean, you said that he aggravated the opponents and he was extremely radical. So, I mean, I was just wondering if a slightly less radical, less, outraging attitude.
Well, that's a good question, but I don't think that Abraham Lincoln himself could have achieved anything in post-war Tennessee, as I said, that was conceivable as a compromise among the competing factions. There was simply no way that the former Confederates were going to be content with anything but total disfranchisement of the blacks. And there was no way that the blacks were going to be satisfied with anything other than, enfranchisement. And so, given that, there is no middle ground on that issue. And so, either the radicals are going to stay in power and keep the blacks enfranchised, or they're going to be out of power and blacks will be totally disfranchised. And that I see as and that was not confined to Tennessee. It was the same in all the former Confederate states. And one by one, they also, after a period of radical Reconstruction, they all, fell to conservative regimes, former Confederates, who promptly deprived the blacks, of their rights. So it was a period of history when I don't see any possibility of compromise.
How did he get elected first and then reelected?
Well, the election in the spring of 1865 was, while the war was still going on, they held an election in March of '65 among a very small electorate of Unionists only. While the war was going on, so not a lot of people were voting, and they were all Unionists because the Confederates were completely, not allowed to vote in that. So he was voted in 1865 on the basis of a very small electorate. And he was so sensitive about that he didn't really command, a broad constituency. That's why he resorts to all these measures, messing with the vote, manipulating the votes, the state guard, even using it against the fellow Unionists, the conservative Unionists, He was worried about them, too. So, yeah, he worried that his administration lacked political legitimacy, and in certain ways it did. The charges of his enemy were true. Other questions?
The last question. Yes.
Getting back to the biography, why do you think no one wants to write another biography?
I don't know if no one wants to do it. I think part of the problem is that nobody will ever be able to write a real full biography of the man because, as I said, we don't know anything about his personal life. So to write about Brownlow is really to write strictly about his public life, okay? And as biased as the Coulter book is, it still gives you pretty good coverage on that. So the next person who writes a book, and it does need to be written, the next person who writes a book is not going to be able to tell us a lot of, and the modern biographers like to give us, the private history of these public people, and you can't do that with Brownlow. So I think maybe it's not an exciting topic to the kinds of writers who are attracted to biography. Like John Adams, has attracted great biographers because we know a lot about his wife, his wife and his relations with his wife, and a lot about his relations with his children and things like that. But with Brownlow, there's simply nothing there to go on.
Well, on that optimistic note.
Thank you all very much.